it would not break. So you have a material that is incredibly strong. It also has some really interesting electrical properties in that it's the most conductive material of electricity that we've found, short of being a superconductor. And superconductors have no resistance, but you have to keep them very, very cold, very controlled conditions to maintain that property. Graphene is just really conductive at room temperature, at pretty much any temperature. So it's really got some very interesting properties.
I'm just trying to picture an elephant standing on a pencil, but
well, physicists love their thought experiments, right? I mean, you gotta put it in terms people can understand, and that's the easiest way for me to understand it. Is that big, massive thing? I can't imagine many things holding up under the weight of that, but yet a single sheet, one atomic layer thin of graphene could.
That's astounding. So, where does graphene come from?
Well, graphene, much to the surprise of the discoverers and most other folks in the chemistry and physics community, has been right under our noses. It has been theoretically thought possible to have carbon in this shape for 50 to 75 years. In fact, people have been looking for it, trying to figure out how to synthesize it, but it wasn't really found until 2004. And it was found just in graphite, common everyday graphite. And in fact, those of us who are above a certain age learned how to write in school by using a graphite pencil on paper.
So you're saying if I take a pencil and make a line on a piece of paper, I'm actually making graphene? That's what the line is?
No, not the whole thing. It's mostly graphite, and graphite is carbon, but it's not so orderly. Most graphite is this, remember the three-dimensional picture I was giving you about different atoms put together? It's carbon strung together in various shapes and different forms of carbon and some impurities mixed in with it. So there are lots of things in the graphite that's in your pencil, and it's not pure graphene. But if you were to burrow into that graphite on your paper, you would find flecks of graphene mixed in with all those other forms of carbon.
You say in your book that the discovery of graphene was accidental.
It was. The discoverers at the University of Manchester in the UK, they were looking for a small piece of graphite, not graphene, because they were doing some electrical conductivity and electrical measurements, and they were actually considering its use as possible transistor in electronics. And so they had a graduate student trying to polish a chunk of solid graphite down to a very small piece so they could characterize it. Well, it turns out he essentially polished it until there was just a pile of graphite, and it wasn't very useful. And they thought, well, maybe we can get a piece and salvage this by looking creatively at how do we get just a very small piece out of this pile of loose graphite. So they used what they later called the Scotch tape method of isolating graphene, which is how they found graphene. So they took this pile of graphite, and imagine you take some of that and you smudge it on a sheet of paper. And then you take a pristine piece of Scotch tape, but any brand of tape would probably work, and you put it on the paper, and then you gently peel up the tape. Part of that graphite, that black substance, will be on the tape. So then you get a clean sheet of paper, you put that on the paper, and you repeat the process, constantly getting less and less of the little black smudge until you get so little you can barely tell anything is there. Well, they did that. They put it under the microscope, turned on their instruments, and lo and behold, among that were these little rectangular sheets of graphene. There it was. And it was pretty astounding. They then worked at characterizing it, figured out some of the properties I've described about its strength and its electrical conductivity. They published, and it's interesting that the first journal they went to rejected it, saying this isn't innovative enough for publication, so they had to go elsewhere. And it was finally published, and that ultimately led to 6 years later, they're getting the Nobel Prize in Physics for its discovery and characterization.
Boy, who would have thought that a piece of Scotch tape would be scientific apparatus that would lead to a major discovery?
Well, I'll tell you, if you look at the history of science up until really the mid-20th century, there were a lot of discoveries in science and engineering made by the lone inventor, the lone person working in the lab somewhere. And in science, we tended to view that era as being over, because now we have to build these big superconducting super colliders and have teams of engineers and teams of physicists trying to unlock new materials and new secrets of nature. In just about every field of science, things are teamwork these days, of big teams. And so there was kind of this philosophical notion that the era of the individual person tinkering in the lab and having a major discovery was over. Well, these guys proved that wrong.
What got you interested in graphene?
Well, this is where there's a little bit of crosswalk with my day job, and I have to point out that my book writing is totally separate from my day job. NASA doesn't endorse hours are supported. Everything I do with this is off the clock. But I was, in my day job, I work on solar sail propulsion technology. And that basically is the use of sunlight reflecting from a large, lightweight, thin film that's reflective, and using the pressure of light reflecting from the film to cause a spacecraft to move, and use that instead of a rocket. It's really nice because you don't require fuel. As long as the sun is shining, you have your propulsion. And current sails are built from essentially a plastic, a polyimide, and we put aluminum on it, and you can fold it and roll it up, and you can launch it. But the problem is, manufacturing on the ground in Earth's gravity, these thin films, they tend to tear, they tend to break. The launch environment is very stressing with all the accelerations, they tend to break. The space environment's actually pretty easy for them to survive in, where they're long, thin films, like a sail on a sailing ship. Well, I read a paper, I don't know, 6 years ago, that theorized if you could get a really big sheet of graphene, that you could use this as a substrate for extremely large sails. Instead of hundreds of square meters, think maybe a square kilometer in size. And then you can start thinking about really aggressive missions that let you send spacecraft really deep into space and ultimately maybe to another star using these technologies.
Okay, so other than sails that could carry us to the planets and other stars in space, what other applications do you see for graphene?
I think it's interesting if you follow the money, right? And you look at what countries and what companies are investing in graphene technologies and what patents they're filing. You find that a lot of Chinese companies, electronics companies in particular, and in South Korea, it seems Samsung is a big investor in this technology. I would venture to say a large fraction of your listeners have had the experience of cracking screens on their cell phone. Well, graphene is transparent, single sheet, one atom layer thick, strong enough to withstand a footprint of an elephant. How many of our phones can have an elephant stand on them and not break? So I think that, and it's also conductive, which is what you need for your screen on a cell phone. So I would say one of the nearer term applications is we're going to see indestructible cell phone screens. I think we're also going to see the cases of cell phones that are in plastic be replaced with graphene or graphene impregnated plastics. In the electronics industry, it is a conductor, so you might see graphene wires and tracings on circuits to replace silver, which is still much more resistive than graphene. So it might speed up our electronics, make them more efficient. And I mean, I could go on and on and on. The use as a replacement for chemical batteries, making these things called supercapacitors for multiple parallel plates of graphene, could really revolutionize the battery industry. So I think we're on the edge of a near-term revolution in communications and electronics from graphene.
You also mentioned in your book that it could help us get to the end of our throwaway culture.
Well, that's right. I mean, if things don't break and you can reuse, we could actually maybe cheaply and affordably go back to the pre-plastic disposable era, where things actually could be manufactured and made very durable and mass-produced cheaply out of more durable materials. We just got through a pretty robust hurricane season in the U.S. last year, and I have friends that live in Florida who experienced the brunt of that hurricane. A lot of broken glass. Imagine if your window panes have a thin sheet of graphene on them, and things are being thrown around in a hurricane, your window doesn't break, right? Maybe make structurally stronger some of your buildings. The possibilities are endless here.
Even if an elephant tries to break into your house.
Yeah, you never know. But I have to give a caution here, and we have a whole chapter on this in the book. These materials show a lot of promise, and in my job as a technologist, having worked on a lot of different technologies over my career, both in NASA and in industry before that, you see some new idea, and it looks really good. But the more you learn about it, and you learn how difficult it is to make, or you learn how difficult it is to integrate into the project that you're working on, the application of it may not be as easy as it looked initially. And so I have to give some concern here that not all of these things are going to pan out. We may not be able to make it in all the ways that we see, but this has got so many applications that even if 10 or 15% of all the ideas that are out there come to fruition, it's going to impact our lives in a big way.
Well, if the potential of this material is so great, why aren't we using it widely now?
Well, it takes time. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is mass production. In your mind, when you first hear how graphene is found, you just imagine some factory somewhere with lots of poor graduate students or students with Scotch tape paper and piles of pencil lead, right, trying to isolate graphene. You won't make many commercial products isolating and separating graphene on that scale. So what's had to happen is, now that the chemists in particular know it's there, they're finding creative ways to mass produce it and make ever bigger pieces of it. But right now we're really limited, as far as I know. I haven't seen good publications on pieces of graphene that are more than millimeter or centimeter scale right now. So we're far away from a cell phone cover. But we are seeing it show up as graphene flakes embedded in other substances to make them stronger, like graphene cases are already out for cell phones that conduct away the heat. Because good electrical conductors are also good thermal conductors, so it allows electronics to operate at cooler temperatures, not that the heat buildup, makes your battery more efficient. It's showing up in sporting goods items, tennis rackets, golf clubs, golf balls. So it's one of those things that I think is going to creep into products more and more as time goes on, but it just takes time. You don't change your manufacturing process, your suppliers, your vendors, how you make everything overnight when a new material or a new discovery comes along. It's more than just the widget. You've got to think of your supply chain, how much investment it's going to take, how long it takes to build a factory. All of those kinds of issues have to come into play, and we're only really at the very beginning of commercialization.
Well, all this hype around graphene reminds me of fusion, which is the promise of unlimited clean energy source. How likely do you think that graphene will ever live up to the hype?
I think graphene will live up to some of the hype in the near term, and maybe most of it in the far term. And I think the applications that use its electrical properties on a small scale will be first. And I think the applications that require large quantities of it, big sheets like for cell phone covers or windows, that'll take a little bit longer. But I think we'll see stuff start popping up in consumer products now. You can already go to stores and see them, and we'll see more and more as time goes on.
Mr. Johnson, thank you very much for your time.
No, it's a pleasure talking about it. You can tell I'm not enthusiastic about this at all.
No, not at all. Les Johnson is the co-author of a new book called Graphene and a physicist at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama.
Tonight on social media, right-wing conspiracy theories going viral about David Hogg, a 17-year-old Parkland shooting survivor. The unsubstantiated claims say he's a crisis actor, a trained actor who takes advantage of tragedies for political gain.
What you are hearing is an NBC News story from last week about the response to survivors from the most recent mass school shooting in Florida. Fringe websites posted articles and videos accusing Hogg of memorizing lines when speaking with the media.
It's disgusting that these trolls are out there trying to make this about me and not the people that were murdered.
Fake news, often fueled by conspiracy theories, has exploded in recent years. The ubiquity of Twitter and Facebook and the ease with which legitimate-seeming websites and blogs and news outlets can be fabricated has made it ever easier to distribute all sorts of misinformation. But researchers from Cambridge in the United Kingdom think they might have a strategy for building resistance to fake news. Their answer isn't to counter it, it's more to join it. They've developed an online game that lets you practice generating and distributing fake news as a novel strategy for immunizing yourself against bad information. Professor Sander van der Linden is director of the Social Decision-Making Lab at Cambridge University. Professor van der Linden, welcome to Quirks and Quarks.
Great being on the show.
First of all, tell me about your game. What do you do when you play it?
Yeah, so we developed this game with a Dutch media collective. They're called Bad News. And the way that the game works is that essentially it lets you step into the shoes of a fake news producer. And so your task in the game is to create misleading content, and you have a followers meter as well as a credibility meter. And the idea is to attract as many followers as possible while also maintaining your credibility levels.
Well, what kinds of activities or tools do you use during the game to spread the fake news?
Yeah, so you start the game essentially by posting something on Twitter, and